Good morning, Tribe Church. We are pumped to be in your TV screen or your computer or your phone, however you're choosing to tune in and worship with us today. We're going to start singing. If you know it, sing it with us. Come on. Darkness tries to roll over my bones. Sorrow comes to steal the joy I own. Brokenness and pain is all I know. I won't be shaken. No, I won't be shaken. Come on, sing this out. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. Stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. There's power that can break off every chain. Power that can empty out the grave. There's resurrection power that can save. There's power in your name. There's power in your name. There's power that can break off every chain. There's power that can empty out. There's resurrection power that can save. There's power in your name. There's power in your name. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. Doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love.
We're heaven-spun creations, His pride and adorations, treasures woven by His love. His careful hands, they hold us, safe within His promise of calling and of destiny. Sing it out. We're heaven-spun creations, His pride and adorations, treasures woven by His love. His careful hands, they hold us, safe within His promise of calling and of destiny. until the end. 'Cause you are faithful, faithful to the end. Father's heart that's full, never-ending story, a love that's always chasing me. His kindness overwhelming, hope for me unending. He's never given up on me.
Come on, and I will sing it out. Come on, hey.
And I will sing of all you've done. And I will remember how far you carried me from beginning until the end. 'Cause you are faithful, faithful to the end. And I will sing of all you've done. And I remember how far you carried me from beginning until the end. 'Cause you are faithful, faithful to the end. Until the There wasn't a day that you weren't by my side. There wasn't a day that you let me fall. In all of my life, your love has been true. So for all of my life, I will worship you. There wasn't a day that you weren't by my side. There wasn't a day that you let me fall. In all of my life, your love has been true. So for all of my life, I will worship you. I will worship you, God.
Worship you.
Hey, good morning, Tribe Church. As you can tell, we are back at Mercy Road on the north side of the city. We're so grateful for the opportunity to be here again. But our worship will not be here today because obviously things are kind of ramped up with the virus and they're taking extreme measures. We're taking extreme measures. So this is probably the last time we're going to film here, but we will be still having things every single week in different ways. So you could expect to watch us online every Sunday at 10 a.m. And it may look a little different, but we have some cool things planned. And believe me when I say you do not want to miss next week. Also, I want to say thank you so much. You might have seen our live update this week about through our partnership with Multiply Indiana and along with a lot of other Central Indiana churches, we were able to support 200,000 N95 masks being delivered here to Central Indiana for at-risk and people in the hospitals as well. So thank you so much for your generosity. So we've always said that, you don't give to the church, you give through the church. And that's such a great example of that. And I do want to thank you for your continued giving and through this difficult time, because obviously we don't want to just survive this, right? We want to come out on the other side of this strong, and it's because of your faithful giving and your generosity that we're able to do things like we did with the masks and hopefully be able to do things in the future. And like we said last week, we have a lot of things on the horizon, and God isn't stopped during this time. And as my shirt says right here, right, hope is not canceled during this time, and there's a lot of hope on the horizon. So please continue doing what you're doing. happening. If we can be of any help to you during this time, please let us know so that we can pray for you and just be with you during this difficult time. But look for those live updates. And today, Pastor Carey has a fantastic message that I really think is going to resonate with you. So listen up well. Oh, and if you have time right now, this is a great time for you to connect with other people around you. Send them a text, send them a quick Marco Polo, something just to let them know you're with them for your Social 30 this week.
Well, good morning, Tribe. Many of you know that I am a teacher by trade, and the end of the school year will actually be my 15th in the classroom, so I've been at this for a while. I've been a part of 4 different school districts, and I've seen a lot of different things and a lot of different philosophies of rulemaking during my 15 years in teaching. When I first started teaching, there was this guy named Ron Clark, and he had what was called the Essential 55, and these were 55 rules for his classroom. And this was back before like Pinterest and Instagram and things like that, where there was a lot of noise in the teaching community. This was the only guy who was making any noise at that point. And so if you weren't teaching with Ron Clark's Essential 55, like you were off the mark. And so this really set the tone for the first couple of years of my teaching. I thought that having a lot of rules meant that I was leading my students well. But about 2 years ago, I went to a workshop offered by Amy Abel called TBRI, which changed my entire life. And TBRI stands for Trust-Based Relational Intervention, and it's actually not a workshop about making rules, but just one of those things that I learned is that kids don't need a lot of rules. In fact, having a lot of rules can actually make things really, really confusing for children. Kids don't need 55 essential rules. What they really need is about 1 or 2 or maybe 3 really, really good ones. Now, Tribe kids, this is your time to shine. I want you to tell your grown-ups what are the 3 rules that we have here at Tribe. So those are stick together, no hurts, and have fun. And that's it, because that's literally all you need. I have used those 3 rules in my classroom with my family, and now here at Tribe with Tribe Kids, and I am here to tell you that those 3 rules are all that you need because they cover all of the bases. Every single thing that you could have a problem with is going to be covered by one of those 3 rules. Stick together, no hurts, and have fun. It makes so much more sense to make things as simple as possible by just having 3 rules to follow than it does to have 55 rules that kids have to follow and that you have to remember to enforce. That was one of my big problems in my early teaching, was that I would break a rule, or I would allow a kid to break a rule, and they'd be like, we're not supposed to do that. And I'd be like, oh yeah, that's one of the essential 55. 55 rules seems like a lot. It's too much. But if you cover just the basic things, it takes care of pretty much everything. Today in our journey with Jesus, he's going to take it one step further. He is not going to take 55 rules and drill them down to 3. He's going to take over 600 rules, and he's going to drill them down to 1. So pay attention, because here we go. We are in week 9 of our Follow Me series, and if this is your first time joining us, let me start off by saying welcome. We are so glad you're here today. I'm so sorry that we can't be here in person with you, but if you'll text the letters VIP to the number that's going to appear on the bottom of your screen, it's going to give you a Connect card to fill out. And if you happen to be on the west side of Indy and you get that Connect card filled out today, we're going to send you a free movie rental to enjoy during this time, because what else are you doing? And we'll make sure that you get all the cool tribe swag when we're able to meet in person again soon. Like I said, well, I say soon, but I don't actually know when that will be. But like I said, we are in week 9 of our Follow Me series. And folks, I have to admit, I was really intimidated by this series. But I really feel like it has made me grow as a pastor, definitely as a preacher, and also just as a follower of Jesus. If you have missed any of the sermons in this series, I highly encourage you to go back and watch them. They're on our Facebook page, they're on our YouTube page. We've tried to make it as simple as possible for you to get those sermons. But this series is kind of like a round of antibiotics. Like, you really need to take all 10 in order to get the full effect, and especially next week. Do not miss next week. And we've said all throughout this series that Jesus came to introduce something brand new to the world and for the world. Pastor Matt talked about last week that Jesus came to make a brand new covenant, a brand new commandment, and a brand new movement. Throughout his 3-year ministry in Galilee and Judea, all of those wonderful things that we just saw in the bumper video. And I do have to admit, I'm really thankful that we're remote right now, because every week, I get a little bit more teary during the bumper video. I get a little bit more emotional during the bumper video. So I'm actually really glad that right before I preach this message, I didn't have to watch it, because it's getting rough. And so but I'm so thankful for it, because every time I watch it, I feel like I see just a little bit more that I recognize from the story of Jesus. But throughout his 3-year ministry, Jesus is dropping hints and leaving signs of what he was really here to do. Because healing the blind and turning water into wine, that's great and all. But no one is going to remember to follow that person who did those things 2,000 years later if that's all that they do. Listen to that. If all you're doing is turning water into wine and making a blind person see, that's not enough to start a movement. It's great, and we're thankful for it. And some people might even call it a miracle, but I'm choosing the word sign because a sign points to something. These are breadcrumbs that Jesus is leaving on the trail. When Jesus would preach, he would say things all the time like, "You have heard it said, but I say." And when we see these words sprinkled throughout the Gospels, "You have heard it said, but I say." And the people would say, "Yeah, we've heard it said over and over again. We've heard it in our parents' house. Our parents have said it to us, and their parents have said it to them, and maybe even to us." That's what Moses said, because Moses was a big deal to the first century Christians. Moses was the one who brought them the commandments that they were to follow. And do you remember that big list of commandments? Do you remember what it was? It was just a big list of rules. And the Jewish people at this time had a big, long list of rules that they had to follow in order to be close to God. That was how it worked. And Jesus also came and he claimed to be greater than the temple. We've talked a lot about this in this series, that the Jewish people at that time loved their temple. So saying to themselves, Jesus, if you're greater than the temple, then we don't need the temple anymore. And that doesn't make any sense because we love our temple. Our temple is a central part of our faith. And so Jesus talked unlike anyone who had ever spoken before. And I think I've said this over and over again throughout this series, but I really believe it. Like, we are on the wrong side of history because we don't understand how radical it was when Jesus said that leaders needed to go to the back of the line. Heck, guys, we live in a town where the slogan is just be kind. You need to understand that without Jesus and his example and his commands that we're going to be talking about today, none of this stuff exists in the Christian world or anywhere else in the world. Because before Jesus, it was all top down. Before Jesus came, leaders leveraged their leadership for their own gain. Leaders didn't have to put their hands on unclean people. Leaders didn't put their hands on unclean people to heal them. This was in conflict for the rest of the world, and it was about to lead to conflict with the rest of the world. The last few weeks we've discussed Jesus' travels from Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, and this was common knowledge. So common, in fact, that the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found out where Jesus was, that they should report it to them so that they could arrest them. How do you stop a movement? You have to cut off the head. You have to get rid of the leader. From the perspective of the chief priests and the Pharisees, Jesus was radical and a blasphemous problem that needed to be taken care of. Who does he think he is when he's saying, you have heard it said, but I say? He's contradicting their scriptures. He's healing people on the Sabbath. He's telling leaders, he's telling them to go to the back of the line. So they sent out spies so that they could arrest him. But it turned out that Jesus was really easy to find, but he wasn't so easy to arrest. And if you've been keeping up with our 90 days through the Gospels, and honestly, it's never too late to start that, you basically read one chapter a day, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and after 90 days, you'll have finished the whole thing. It's really great, and it's gone along really well with this series. So if you haven't started that, it's not too late. But if you have started that, you know that the Gospels are constantly saying that wherever Jesus went, there was a great crowd of people there waiting for him, or people gathered around him or walking with him, or that had figured out where he was and went there. In fact, as he entered the city of Jerusalem, there was a great crowd of people in the streets crying, Hosanna, 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 which is a word that expresses adoration and joy and praise. They thought that Jesus was going to do something huge at Passover in Jerusalem. And I think, and this is just me, but I think they thought that Jesus was going to declare himself king like David was king. They thought that Jesus was coming to do something for them. But Jesus didn't come to do something for them. Jesus had come to do something for you and for the entire world and for all of history. And one of Jesus' followers broke rank. And Judas started to put the pieces together, and he thought to himself. So Judas, the thing you need to know about Judas is listening this whole time. And he's picking up on these breadcrumbs that Jesus is leaving. When Jesus is saying, leaders eat last, and Jesus is saying, go to the back of the line, and Jesus is saying that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And he's like, well, if he is saying he's greater than the temple, and first shall be last and last shall be first, maybe when he gets to Jerusalem, maybe he's not going to declare himself king and sit on a throne and rule. Maybe this is all going to go poorly. And so Judas decides, if this is going to end badly anyway, I might as well get paid for it. And so he breaks away from the group and goes to the chief priests, and he says, if you want Jesus, I can give you Jesus. And I'm sure they were like, yeah, okay, we know where he is. He's in Jerusalem. He's in the upper room, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, no, I can give you Jesus when there's no one else around. I can do something for you that no one else can do. I can give you Jesus alone. And they agreed, and they paid him. And our text says he watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when there was no crowd present. And Pastor Matt's going to preach about it next week, but what ends up happening is Jesus and his guys, they kind of have the conversation we're about to talk about, and then they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus is praying by himself, and he goes and he prays by himself, and like the guys are with him, but he's kind of off on his own, and Jesus comes back and they're asleep, and he's like, can't you even, like, he says to Peter, he's like, Peter, you can't even stay awake for 1 hour and pray with me? Like, I'm clearly freaking out right now, but phew, it all goes over the disciples' heads. They just don't get it, and that's where Judas shows up, and that's where Pastor Matt's going to pick it up next week, but we've got other stuff to cover today. So in the end, those people who came to arrest Jesus, their plan would succeed, but their objective would fail entirely. Because when the time came, Jesus didn't cling to his life. All along, he had come to give his life. But before he could do that, he had 2 loose ends that he needed to tie up. The first was to state that he was establishing a new kind of relationship between God and mankind. And in the upper room, Pastor Matt preached about this so well last week. Jesus changed the game. For those of you who grew up in church like me, you need to sit up and you need to listen right now. Did you get last week's sermon? Like, did you understand what Pastor Matt was saying? I know it's easy to be distracted by how fabulous it is here at Mercy Road, but you might need to go back and re-listen to that, because if you grew up in church like I did, you grew up knowing that every week, at some point during the service, they were going to be like, and as they were eating, Jesus took bread and broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body broken for you. I mean, how many of you can quote that by heart along with me? Because you heard it over and over again every single week in church. You heard it every week. And these were words that we have heard over and over again. But what I didn't understand, even I didn't understand until last week, was that these were words that Jesus' followers had heard over and over and over again, that the bread represented the bread that the Israelites had made quickly as they were leaving Egypt, and the wine represented the blood of the lambs that were slaughtered and spread over the doorframes during the 10th plague that killed the first sons of Egypt. These were part of Passover every year. I mean, imagine just for a second if we read those words on a Sunday morning, but I was like, this is my body, this is Carrie Dilly's body that is broken for you, and this is my blood, this is Carrie Dilly's blood that is spilled for you. You would be appalled, right? You would think that was blasphemous. And you would be right. That would be appalling, and that would be blasphemous, and I would never, ever do that. When Jesus is saying, these things that you've always done, you're not going to look at them and think about Moses. You're going to look at them and you're going to think about me, because he was establishing a new covenant. This signaled the end of God's conditional covenant with the nation of Israel. God's covenant with Israel was conditional in 2 ways. One, you had to follow those rules, and there were a lot of them. There were over 600 rules that they had to follow. And 2, it was only people who were born into the Jewish faith. This was basically a religion for one very large family. But God's new covenant that he was establishing through his son was for everybody, and it had very, very different rules. And Jesus' closest followers should have seen this coming, because all along throughout his ministry, he is dropping breadcrumbs on the trail. He keeps hinting that something new is coming, that he was coming to replace everything that was in place. For example, about 10 or 11 months before Passover, Jesus has an interaction that is a major breadcrumb. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were constantly trying to embarrass him in front of a crowd so that they could get him away from the crowd so that they could arrest him. Because how do you stop a movement? You cut off the head of its leader. That's how you do it. It says in Matthew 22:15, then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words, and they sent their disciples to them because they were too famous to go. They would have immediately have been found out. So they sent their underlings so that they wouldn't be recognized. And these guys were supposed to sit in the crowd and blend in with the crowd, and when Jesus gets to the Q&A portion of his talk, they would chime in with a very specific and very purposeful question. "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity." You see how they're buttering him up? "And we know that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. And we know that you are not swayed by any other because you pay no attention to who they are." That's from Matthew 22:16. And they ask him whether they should pay their taxes. And Jesus responds with, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." And so the first trap doesn't work. Not to be deterred, they try again. It's the same scenario. The Sadducees send another underling to try to trip up Jesus with a word puzzle this time. They say, "Teacher, they said that Moses told us that if a man dies without having any children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for him." It's from Matthew 22:24. And this was a good law in ancient times because women were so vulnerable back then. If a woman's husband died and there were no children that could take care of her, very bad things could happen to her. And so this law ensured that she would be taken care of. So the brother would marry her and have children with her, but the children would actually carry the first brother's name so that he would not be forgotten. And if you want to learn more about this law, go and read the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. It spells it out there really, really simply and really clearly, and it will actually help you understand some of Jesus' lineage a little bit better, and it's only 4 chapters long. You've got time right now. So go read the book of Ruth. Not right now, though, because you need to hear the rest of this. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees are always trying to separate Jesus from Moses. That's what they're trying to do because Moses was an incredibly important figure to them. And they thought if they could get Jesus to speak out against Moses, that he might lose the crowd, and again, they can arrest him. So they go on, and in Matthew 22:25, they say, "Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. And then the second brother died without having children, and she married the third brother. And then the third brother dies without having children, and she marries the fourth brother, and so on and so forth until she's married all 7 brothers." Now, some of you may not know this, but Matt actually has 5 brothers. And so I'm thankful that Jesus came to establish a new covenant for this policy only. I'm really glad that I didn't end up having to be married to James and Henry and Eric and Nick and finally Adam, and especially Adam, for those of you who know Adam. So at the end of the Sadducees' riddle, the end of the Sadducees' riddle is this: when she gets to heaven, when she eventually dies, who is she married to? And I'm sure that everybody in the crowd is like, whoa, that's a good question. Like, who is she married to? Like, is it the one she liked the most? Is it the first one? Is it the last one? It was the one she was married to the longest? Like, who knows? The point of this question was to point out how ridiculous it was to believe in an afterlife, because the Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife. That's why they were sad, you see. It would be so great if you guys were here so you could laugh with me about that. They believed that we live for the pleasure of God, and when that was done, we were just sort of over. And so this question pointed out how ridiculous it was to believe in an afterlife. And Jesus responded to them that by telling them that they don't understand the scriptures or the power of God, and sends them scurrying off to their handlers, not having accomplished the task that they were set out for. And the crowd was astonished at his teaching. It says in Matthew 22:33 through 34, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. So when the Pharisees heard that the Sadducees got shot down, somewhere my speech teacher is very proud of me right now, guys. They're like, all right, it's our turn. Here we go. So the Pharisees, this time, they pick a lawyer. They pick one of their best guys to go and blend in with the crowd. And when the time is right, they are going to bring Jesus down with one powerful question. And I bet if you were raised in church, or you've paid attention during this series, or if you're caught up with our 90 Bible reading, you can guess which one it is. Oh, that's right, there's nobody here. This was another huge breadcrumb moment on the trail that Jesus is leaving, and points to the fact that he has come to do something brand new to the world and for the world. One of the experts in the law tests Jesus with this question, which I'm sure you would have called out if you were here. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment? This is in Matthew 22:35 and 36. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? The law refers to the law of Moses, or the 600 or so rules that Moses brought down with him, that God gave him on Mount Sinai, that all the Jewish people had to live by. Because they wanted to, if they wanted to have a relationship with God, they had to follow these 600 rules. So just like you know the answer to this question, so did the people who were gathered around them, because it was part of their sacred text. There was a standard answer to this question. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Matthew 22, 37 through 38. And the lawyer and probably everyone else in the audience could have mouthed that answer right around with them. But the point wasn't that first question that the lawyer asked. The point was to get Jesus to commit to that standard answer and then trap him with a second question, which Jesus, of course, knew. And so the lawyer is about to ask his second question. And Jesus says, and the second one is like it. Silence. What? The second one is like it. It was supposed to be like the first one, love the Lord your God, and then all this other stuff, all these other little rules. But when Jesus says the second one is like it, that got their attention. I'm sure heads whipped around. Love your neighbor as yourself. And that word like is really important here too, because the crowd gathered, they would have understood this. The crowd gathered around Jesus would have understood this, but I think because we're on the wrong side of history and we've heard this a million times, I think we miss it somehow. That the word like points to the fact that the second commandment is second in sequence alone. These two commandments are equal. These two commandments are equal. The second is just as great as the first. This is the first time in recorded history that these two verses are put together. One is found in Deuteronomy and one is found in Leviticus. And this was a signal that things were shifting from the top-down approach and the religious world where Jesus lived. And perhaps in the religious world where you grew up also had a top-down approach, because people could love God but treat people poorly without that second commandment. You could love God and treat people poorly, and you might have had a religious experience where that's happened to you, where someone claims to love God, but they treat people poorly. And if they're confronted, they can be like, oh, no, it's okay. It's okay, because I'm good with God. You see, I've confessed my sins. I'm in ministry. I tithe. I pray. I read my Bible. Me and God, we're good. But listen to the way that you talk about your son, or the way you talk to your son, or look at the way that you treat your wife, or look at what you just said to your employee. And they're like, oh yeah, but me and God, we're good. It doesn't matter how I treat people. This is what religion looked like in ancient times, and unfortunately, sometimes this is how religion works here in the United States today. But Jesus, when we listen to him, he told us that he was here to do something brand new. And he goes on to say, all of the law and the prophets hang on this commandment. That's Matthew 22:40. And that meant the Bible, because they didn't have a Bible like we do today. Jesus never said, read your Bible, because there wasn't a Bible. They had sacred text, and they called them the law and the prophets. So anytime you're reading in the New Testament and you see the words, the law and the prophets, that's what it's talking about. And he's saying here that the entire Old Testament, all the way from Genesis to Malachi, hangs on these two commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. If Jesus had a screen right then, I think this is what would have popped up on it next. Love God, love your neighbor. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So when you're reading Isaiah and you get confused, go back to those two commandments. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor. When you get in the weeds of Leviticus and 2 Kings, go back to those two commandments. When you're reading something in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, and the one that Jesus had come to replace, and it doesn't make any sense, just go back to those two commandments. Love God, love your neighbor. Everything else in the law and the prophets is history, it's explanation, it's commentary. The two most important things, and we're basing this on what Jesus said, are love God and love your neighbor. In other words, love for God is best illustrated, demonstrated, and authenticated by love for others. The problem for a first century Jewish person would have been, at this point, to question, who is my neighbor? Remember back a bit ago I said that Jesus had two loose ends to tie up? This is the other one. The question is, who is my neighbor? In Leviticus 19:18, where Jesus got the command, love your neighbor as yourself, actually gave a definition for the word neighbor. It's another Jewish person. So what Jesus has to do here is he has to take it a step further. And a couple weeks later, he's in another situation, and another lawyer asks him a question. And in response to that question, Jesus changes the word neighbor for every generation afterwards. And it's a story that you know. And I know that you know it because the story that Jesus tells in response to this question, who is my neighbor, is a phrase that we still use today. And I'm sure if you were here right now, you would call it out because there are charities and nonprofits who still use this phrase. There are actually laws to protect people who are just trying to help, and they're called, and you would yell it if you were here, you might be yelling it at your TV right now, they're called Good Samaritan laws. Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. And at the end of this parable, he answers the question. He changes the definition from someone who is Jewish like you, someone who looks like you, someone who talks like you, someone who likes what you like. No, from now on, a neighbor is anyone, anywhere that has a need that you can meet. A neighbor is anyone, anywhere that has a need that you can meet. Now, Jesus says love for God is best illustrated, demonstrated, and authenticated by love for others who are nothing like you and who may not even like you. And this was so new. And the crowd that had gone around him, for each one of these separate stories of what Jesus was doing, these were breadcrumbs that he was leaving of what he came to do. These were all signs pointing to the new rules of a new covenant. And he chose Passover for the big reveal of these two new truths. They had just finished the meal, and then he humiliates them by washing their feet. Nothing right now is going the way that the disciples had planned it. And then Judas goes and runs this quick errand. And Jesus, having replaced Moses as the covenant maker when he led the very first Last Supper, Jesus has established a brand new covenant between God and all of mankind, and they don't even understand it at the time. And then Jesus steps into the role of lawgiver. The new covenant, just like the one that replaced it, would not be on 1,000 different thou shalts and thou shalt nots. He's not going to have 600 rules. He's not going to even have 2 rules. And this is one of the most important moments in the life of Jesus. And I hate that for centuries and centuries, such little emphasis has been given to this, because what happens next would ultimately change the world. In John 13:34, Jesus, he says these words to these people, and they have no idea the significance of these words. He says, "A new command I give you." And they'd have been out of their minds if they had been in their right minds at this point. They would have said, no, only God can give commands. They knew the story of Moses up on Mount Sinai. They would have been told that when they were little kids, just like you were. God gave Moses the commands, and Moses delivered the law, but Moses didn't write commands. It's as if Jesus is literally stepping into his role as God at this moment. And they might have also said something like, we don't really need any more commands. We have 600, and then you've given us these other 2. And so is it going to be 603, or is it going to be 3, or we're just not sure? Are we just going to keep stacking commands on top of commands on top of commands on top of commands? And Jesus says this, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you." Jesus had not come to add 2. Jesus had come to reduce even 2 commandments down to 1 commandment. Folks, if you are ever lucky enough to have been to Tribe in real life, you might have noticed that we don't take communion every week, but we do every week. Every week we close our service with the words, "Love is the best thing that we do." Because Matt and I knew when we started this church that if the church gets this right, everything changes. When you create a church with the sole purpose of loving one another the way Jesus loved them, that's why when you create a church with the sole purpose of loving one another the way Jesus loved them, that's when everything changes in the life of the people that you're with. That's why when you're broken and beat down and you feel worthless and you come to Tribe, you feel better. People at Tribe, this is why we kick your butts when we don't have somebody out there greeting in that parking lot, because we want people to feel the love of God from the moment their tires hit that parking lot, before they're ever even out of their car. That's why we paid to keep the lights on for 7 families in Plainfield this past winter. That's why we were part of a movement that provided, 200,000 masks or something like that for hospitals and for people who need them right now. Because God gave us one thing to do, to love one another the way he loved us. That's why we show grace to you when you mess up, and why we expect you to show grace to us when we mess up. That's why when you come to Tribe, you are loved and accepted no matter who you are and no matter what you have done, because Jesus left us with one thing to do, to love one another as he loved us. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Not if you love Jesus, because Jesus was leaving. Not if you love God, because that's between you and God, but your love for one another. That is how you show your love for God. That is how you demonstrate your love for Jesus, by how well you love the people who are difficult to love. Compared to the incredibly complicated system that the Jewish people had, the rules and the regulations they had grown up with, this was far less complicated, but far more demanding. Jesus knew something that I think we as kids and teenagers knew, but sometimes we forget as adults. The more rules you have to follow, the more places there are for there to be loopholes. And the more places people are likely to look, more rules you have, the more likely people are to look for loopholes. Because where there are rules, plural, there is space. There are cracks in the foundation. Ask anyone who's ever taken a law class or has become a lawyer. Lots of rules means lots of interpretation of those rules. This is why people say, well, what does the Bible say about? Because I want to do this. And if the Bible's not okay with it, then I won't do it. But if you could just give me a list of rules so that I can look at those rules and I can kind of interpret them for myself and decide what they're going to say, so that I can, look at the world and the Bible through my own lens of my own childhood and my own past and my own pain. And that's how I want to interpret the Bible. That would be really great. And if Jesus had left us a bunch of rules to follow, I do think that would have been what happened. Because I know that a lot of people, they don't want to go against God specifically, but if he doesn't mention it specifically, then am I good to go? This is why this question is the modern version of what the first century people were asking: what does the law require? Every New Testament imperative, especially those that come after the resurrection, is simply an application of this rule: love as I have loved you. The New Covenant command closed all of the loopholes. It doesn't leave any wiggle room. Love as I have loved you. It is so much less complicated, but it is so much more demanding. Because if you love Jesus, if you love other people the way Jesus loved you, that means I can't just think about the you who's standing in front of me. I have to think about your past and your future. That means if I date you, I have to be respectful of your future spouse and how they would want you to be treated and what things they would want you to do, even if that person is not going to be me. It means that I have to show grace to people when it takes them longer to get it than it should. It means putting down your phone and walking away instead of engaging with some battle with someone that you don't even know on the internet. It means not talking about people behind their back, even when there's no chance that they're ever going to know. It means that I have to show kindness even when you don't deserve it. It means that I personally have to forgive the people who challenge my ability to lead the church and say terrible things about me because I'm a woman and I'm a pastor. They cut right through my insecurities and see my shortcomings every time they do that, because I'm not always sure what to believe, and I'm not always sure what the Bible says about X, Y, or Z, especially some random verse from the Old Testament. But I usually know what love requires of me. I usually know what the loving choice is to make. I saw those words, "What does love require of you?" for the first time in one of the books that I read last year called Irresistible by Andy Stanley. And if you have liked this series, you should definitely read that book. I saw those words, "What does love require of you?" And I wrote them down, and I taped them to my mirror, and I've looked at them every day since, both in the morning and in the evening. What does love require of you? How do you begin loving people like Jesus in a modern age? If you're looking for that, the answer to that question, that book is a good place to start. I think if we would just ask ourselves this question with every decision, every interaction, it would create a change in us. Back in my day, we used to wear these little WWJD bracelets to remind us to do what Jesus would do. And I don't think they worked very well because I spent a lot of my teenage years judging people who didn't live up to my ridiculous standards. And I was hypercritical and sometimes hypocritical of those people. And there's a new movement, and I think it's a better movement than WWJD because it answers that question, what does love require of you? It's called HWLF. He would love first. So much less complicated, and so much more demanding. If you've learned nothing else from this 10-week series, please, please learn this. One command I leave you: love as I have loved you, as I have taught you, as I have been patient with your questions, as I have given you grace when you didn't get it, as I have walked with you, as I have laughed with you, as I have fed you, as I have forgiven you, as I have washed your dirty, stinky, smelly feet. As I have loved you, you are to love one another.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Please remember as you leave this week that love is the best thing that we do. Look right at this camera right here, if you want. Okay, I'm gonna say I can do that. Whatever's easy, I can make it easy. No.
All right, so I thought if I was here, I was supposed to be here. No, always here. Only here? Okay. I'm sorry you have to edit this. That Moses, okay. Before it was here, it was all, I'm sorry. I'm gonna go back. So sorry.
I was gonna give you something to drink, but I thought, I don't wanna I don't know.
Well, and then I was like, in a real service, I could get through this.
That's what I thought. That's why I was like,
I just started coughing.
I was like, in a real service, you would just go.
Yeah. It is a